In September, we'll be getting Silent Hill Townfall, the latest game in the franchise following last year's Silent Hill F. Both are using Unreal Engine 5, although they are coming from different development teams. And Silent Hill Townfall is featuring a first-person camera perspective as opposed to last year's third-person perspective that we got with Silent Hill F. So it can be somewhat interesting to compare the system requirements for the two games. On the right here, I have Silent Hill F, and on the left, I have Silent Hill Townfall, the upcoming game. But they won't be exactly comparable because, again, despite being in the same series and both using Unreal Engine 5, there are those differences. Now, there's certainly some interesting things that I'm noticing here with Silent Hill Townfall. For one thing, while it is just the minimum and recommended system requirements, they're kind of giving the targets in a little bit of a frustrating manner. So, for example, their recommended spec is targeting high settings at 4K 30 using DLSS, FSR, or TSR balanced mode, which I feel like for PC gamers, it would be better to give us either 1440p or 1080p targets rather than 4K 30 targets for the recommended spec. Because while a lot of people on PC do game on 4K monitors, I think that's a lot of times people with like super high-end systems, and a much more common option for a normal mid-range PC build, or even a pretty high-end build, would be a 1440p display, and especially not targeting 30 frames per second. So I would have much rather had, 1440p 60 FPS targets as opposed to 4K 30 targets. But maybe I'll actually just start with that. So there's asking for an RTX 3080 or an RX 7800 XT in order to hit the 4K 30 with DLSS, FSR, or TSR balanced mode. So what does that really mean? First of all, I'll mention that compared to last year's Silent Hill F, the AMD GPU they're listing is fairly similar. The 6800 XT and the 7800 XT are within like 5% performance of each other. There wasn't much progress that generation for the 800 XT class. Now, this time around, though, they're actually making a reasonable pairing on the NVIDIA side with the RTX 3080, whereas last year they paired the 2080 with the 6800 XT, which made absolutely no sense, and I heavily criticized in my coverage of the PC system requirements as being a complete nonsense pairing. So, 3080 7800 XT makes more sense and is pretty close to last year's recommended spec, but again, last year they kind of listed different things. They were talking about the performance preset at 60 FPS or quality settings and 30 FPS at full HD, or using 4K using DLSS or similar technology. So this at least makes more sense what they're like how they're describing what they're targeting, the high settings at 4K 30 using DLSS, FSR, or TSR balanced. Now, let's talk about this for a second. First of all, you might not have those exact GPUs. So where does that put us? Also, how does it compare to the minimum spec? The minimum spec they're listing is an RTX 2060 Super or RX 6600, and if I set that as the baseline on Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart, we can now scroll up, find the recommended GPUs, and see kind of how much scaling there is between the minimum and recommended. Looks like they're asking for about double the performance between their minimum and recommended hardware. And again, the 7800 XT and the 3080 are very close in performance to each other here. This also means that cards in a similar ballpark, although not exactly identical, would be cards like the 5060 Ti or a 6900 XT, RTX 4070, 9060 XT. These are all cards in the similar sort of ballpark of performance as what we're getting from the recommended spec. Now, what do I think this would get you on like a 1440p monitor? I do have some thoughts. So 4K using quality upscaling has an internal rendering resolution of 1440p. But it then has a additional performance overhead of doing the actual upscale, meaning that while balanced mode upscaling on a 4K output actually has a bit lower internal rendering resolution than 1440p, it then applies the upscale. So in other words, 4K with a balanced upscale often performs similarly, not identically, but similarly to 1440p at native resolution. So I would guess that the cards they're listing at 4K 30 with balanced upscaling would be close to that same FPS at native 1440p. which means if you used 1440p with like quality or balanced upscaling, I actually think you'd have a good shot at being around 60 FPS. So I would guess that these 3080 and 7800 XT class GPUs would probably be hitting 1440p 60 FPS with upscaling, probably around the quality or balanced setting on the upscaling, and Unreal Engine 5 does tend to get large performance boosts when using upscaling. So I think that would be fairly key there. So that is speculation, but it's an educated guess based on the resolutions involved here and how Unreal Engine 5 tends to respond to upscaling. So that's just kind of general thoughts. Now, note that they are also saying 32 gigabytes of system memory is recommended, which didn't used to be a big deal, but now that's like hundreds of dollars of system memory when it didn't used to be. Their minimum requirement is just listing 16 gigabytes of system RAM, so there is that. Now let's take a little look at the minimum specs. They are asking for a 2060 Super, not just a 2060, or an AMD RX 6600. Now these are close in performance, so that's a reasonable pairing. Also, both are 8 gigabyte GPUs. The normal 2060 non-Super would have been a 6 gigabyte GPU, and isn't in a completely different performance tier, so it's interesting to me that they did go with the 2060 Super, and I wonder if that means that you could struggle on 6 gigabyte cards. That's just speculation, but it's, again, kind of educated guess based on the fact that they chose the Super card here. Now they're talking about low settings at 1080p 30 FPS. Now interestingly here, they did not mention any upscaling when they're saying low settings 1080p 30. Now that doesn't always mean anything, but in these same system requirements charts, they did mention upscaling for the recommended. So they are clearly willing to list upscaling being used here, but didn't on this setting. So we could take that to mean that they are targeting native 1080p 30 FPS at low settings, and I certainly hope so, because if these cards are only hitting 30 FPS with upscaling at 1080p, that would be very concerning. If it's without upscaling, if it's native 1080p 30, that's still pretty demanding for low settings, but at least you could use DLSS quality or FSR quality or balanced to try to get some performance back. And like I said, Unreal Engine 5 usually does gain a lot of performance from upscaling. So let's actually take a look at what other cards are kind of nearby that sort of performance tier. So 2060 Super and RX 6600 are a pretty reasonable pairing here. RTX 2070 is also in a pretty similar performance class. Cards like the RX 5700 XT, RX 6600 XT, RTX 3060. These are all in a similar performance class, and even the 1080 Ti would usually be a little bit more powerful than that, although 10 series cards, sometimes drivers and things, no longer responding as well as they used to, so keep that in mind when looking at things like the relative performance chart here. As far as cards that would fall a little under this minimum spec but would still be pretty close, cards like the RTX 2060 non-Super, but again, 6 gigabytes of VRAM, is that going to be an issue? There's a question there. RX 5700, GTX 1080, 1070 Ti, 5600 XT. Those are all cards in this kind of general ballpark. Now you can follow I'll link this in the video description if you want to kind of try to find where your card falls relative to this. So again, 1080p 30 already at low settings, so you couldn't really turn things down further, but like I said, hopefully that's at native resolution, so you could use quality or balanced upscaling to try to get closer to 60 FPS, even if it doesn't quite get you there. Maybe you'll be in kind of that 40 to 50 FPS land where it's, playable and helps if you have a variable refresh rate display to kind of smooth the frame pacing out or something like that. So I mean, that's somewhat demanding, I would say, for just low settings at 30 FPS, but it's Unreal Engine 5 and we are in 2026 now. So, the 2060 Super was a 2019 card. I think it's going on 7 years old now. It came out, it's 2019 in July. So yeah, right at 7 years old, at $399 launch price. So, I mean, it is aging hardware, but it's frustrating when, prices and generational uplifts haven't been super amazing since then. So, all right, any like kind of final thoughts on this would be like CPU related. Ryzen 5 3600 or i7 8700K isn't asking a ton. Ryzen 5 3600 tends to have similar gaming performance to what you get out of like a PS5 or Xbox Series X. The recommended CPU jumping up to a Ryzen 7 5700X is a bit more powerful. There was a noticeable jump there, but it's not like twice the performance or anything like that. Hopefully, you could at least get 60 FPS there, even though their requirements are only targeting 30. So, it's like really frustrating that they didn't give any specs targeting 60 FPS. That is a little bit frustrating, but overall, it kind of is what it is, and I think we can't really learn too much more until we actually get the game to test out. Let me know if you're interested in me benchmarking it when it comes out. I did benchmark Silent Hill F when it came out, and you could kind of maybe I'll link that in the video description as well if you want to take a look at the performance that game received. But like I said, despite being in the same series on Unreal Engine 5 and only 1 year apart, it is different actual development teams and differences in camera, etc. So I wouldn't take that as exactly telling you what you'll get in this game. So hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and y'all have an excellent day.